topic of this panel is governance from the state perspective. I'm Lynn Baker from the University of Texas Law School, and I have with me John Dinan of Wake Forest, Bruce Cain of Stanford, and I've asked them in their preliminary remarks to talk about two basic questions that I think at this point in the conference are probably in the minds of everyone, or at least those of us who care about states. The first is, are the states in general more governable than the federal government? And to what extent might this be due to institutional differences? And is it a good thing if it's true? And then a second question is, what general lessons about governability can be drawn from the experience of the half of the states in which direct democracy, in particular the initiative, is available? And we're going to go in order of reverse seniority. So John?
Thank you, Lynn. Let me start off by thanking Sandy for this invitation to this wonderful conference. I want to take off from a point that's been made several times throughout the conference, and that is the challenge of governability at the federal level is only in part a product of polarization and party cohesiveness. It's really best viewed as a product of a combination of party cohesiveness and polarization, along with a particular set of institutional arrangements that we have in place at the federal level. And I want to focus on these institutions. I mean, obviously at the federal level, we have a separation of power system that can produce a system of divided government, combined with giving the executive a particularly strong veto that can only be overcome by a 2/3 override, combined with a filibuster rule in the Senate that essentially makes it necessary to get to 60 votes. The effect of these institutional arrangements in producing policy gridlock and in preventing passage of policies is, of course, evident. One could cite many cases. Let's look at the last 2 years of the Bush administration. We're here, the strong executive veto combined with the 2/3 override rule made it difficult for Democratic majorities in the House and Senate to accomplish certain of their goals, including quicker winding down of the Iraq War. And in the first 2 years of the Obama presidency, we got a period of unified Democratic government. And here the 60-vote requirement in the Senate frequently prevented passage of policies, whether climate change policies, changes to union organizing rules, and of the policies that did pass, was health care reform, long, arduous process to say the least. So this is the situation that we're all familiar with at the federal level. I want to turn to the states. The story at the state level is that policy gridlock is less prevalent. Now, as soon as I say that, immediately leap to mind exceptions to this case of policy gridlock and difficulty in passing policy at the state level. One thinks probably of difficulties in the sense of undergoing government shutdown or budget impasse, as it happened in Minnesota for 3 weeks in the summer of 2011. Or we think back to Wisconsin, where collective bargaining changes were stalled for several months, even involved an extended walkout of minority party legislators before this eventually passed in the summer of 2011. Or others are probably thinking of California, where the long-running inability to raise taxes to cut into a budget deficit was finally overcome with passage of a constitutional initiative last November. Yes, there are these cases of policy gridlock at the state level and the difficulty of passing policies at the state level. But these high-profile cases of gridlock should distract us from the case that the more normal state of affairs in state policy is now more on the line of the speed and ease of passage of policy, certainly in contrast with the situation at the federal level. Let's just look at the last several years of states. There's been a time where it's been difficult to secure tax increases at the federal level. You get sizable increases to individual income tax rates passed in a lame duck session in Illinois in January of 2011. We got tax increases in Connecticut, tax increases in Maryland. These all passed in the last few years at the state level. Similarly, given the difficulty of passing federal statutes adjusting union organizing rules, it's striking to see the speed with which a lame duck Michigan legislature just last month passed a significant right to work law. And they're not alone in terms of other state legislatures and governors that have passed significant changes in union organizing and bargaining rules in just the last few years. One could point to Other issues, states, the legalizing of medical marijuana, first in 17 states, and now, of course, recreational marijuana in 2 states. Or the surge of measures restricting abortion availability at the state level in the last 2 years. Or the surge of measures regarding illegal immigration, many of them passed at the state level. All of these are in situations where the federal government has not passed major policies in these areas, and yet we turn to the states and we see significant policies passed oftentimes speedily and easily. So how to explain this? When we turn to explain this difference in the level of federal and state policy gridlock, one explanation that once held more weight no longer holds as much weight. Although in earlier years, polarization and party cohesiveness were somewhat less prevalent at the state level than at the federal level, this is increasingly not the case. There is little evidence that governing officials and elites are less polarized, or that parties are less cohesive in opposing one another in the states than at the federal level. In this sense, cases of bipartisan passage of important policies, such as occurred in Rhode Island in 2011 with enactment of a major pension reform, these are actually quite the rare cases. Well, if that explanation doesn't take us all that far, another explanation takes us further, and I'm sure this is the explanation that people have in mind as they've been starting this, and that is, it's true that increasingly one party controls all branches of a state government. As we've heard, 30 states are now unified party governments, 24 of them Republican hands, 13 controlled by Democrats. And clearly the prevalence of unified party control of government accounts for a good part of the speed and frequency of passage of policies in the states, in contrast with the federal level, which has been under divided government for all but 8 of the last 32 years. But, here's my argument, the prevalence of unified party control of government at the state level does not offer a complete explanation for the relative absence of party gridlock in the states compared with the federal government. A full explanation has to take account of at least 3 institutional differences between the state and federal level. I'll focus today on first, the relative but not complete absence of filibuster rules or their equivalent at the state level. Second, the presence of weaker voter veto override rules in a subset of states. And third, the presence of direct democracy in half of the states. Well, the most important institutional difference is the relative absence of filibusters or their equivalent. Precise estimates and numbers are hard to come by, and it depends on how you code certain rules in state legislatures. National Conference of State Legislatures counts 12 state legislatures that require a supermajority vote to cut off debate. Sometimes in both chambers, sometimes in just one chamber of the state legislatures. But even in these 12 states, actual exercise of the filibuster is quite rare. In fact, the number of states where you actually have filibusters is really about a handful. Alabama, South Carolina, Nebraska, of course the only unicameral body. In Nebraska last year, a photo ID law clearly had majority support in the legislature, but failed to pass because it was filibustered and couldn't overcome a 2/3 cloture rule. I should stress this by no means exhausts the supermajority rules in place at the state level. Another 6 states provide for supermajority quorum requirements. On various occasions in recent years, minority parties have taken advantage of these quorum rules by staging walkouts tantamount to filibusters. Of course, this was employed by Democrats in Texas to stall legislative redistricting in 2003. It was employed by Democrats in Wisconsin to stall for a time changes in collective bargaining rules in 2011, and it was, of course, employed by Democrats in Indiana to stall passage of a right-to-work law last year. So even though actual filibusters are rare, walkouts to take advantage of supermajority quorum rules have sometimes been used in the 6 states with such rules, Tennessee, Oregon, and Vermont being the other 3 of the 6. But one would also have to take note of various supermajority rules for the passage of certain policies. The most famous, of course, because it's gotten so much attention, is California's 2/3 requirement for increasing taxes, which allowed minority Republicans to prevent passage of tax increases for the last several years until passage of tax increase initiative passed in November. California is not alone. A dozen other states have similar supermajority rules for increasing taxes or fees. And then there's supermajority rules for enacting budgets. California used to have one, but it was eliminated through the initiative process several years ago, leaving Arkansas and Rhode Island as the only states that currently have a supermajority requirement for passing a budget. Well, the main point with these kind of exceptions being noted, that is occasional filibusters, occasional supermajority requirements, and a somewhat more occasional supermajority rules for financial matters. These exceptions have been noted. My main point is that most states do not operate under supermajority requirements for closing off debate or for passing policy. And this clearly allows a party that controls the House, Senate, and Executive to pass its preferred policies in a way that's much speedier than at the federal level. A second institutional difference: 14 states allow the legislature to override executive vetoes by less than a 2/3 requirement. In 7 states by a bare majority, and in other 7 states by a 3/5 vote. In situations of divided party government, these weaker override rules can play an important role in reducing policy gridlock by enabling a party in control of the legislature to overcome resistance by a governor of another party. This was on full display in North Carolina during the last 2 years, when Republicans controlled the House and Senate and faced a Democratic governor. Republicans, the House and Senate, passed budgets in 2011, 2012, and were able to prevent a government shutdown in the face of executive vetoes by the Democratic governor because they had 3/5 in one house and were able to get to 3/5 with some help of Democrats in another house. And this is likely to prove important in Arkansas in coming years, where newly gained narrow Republican majorities in the House and Senate can override vetoes of Democratic governor by a bare majority. Well, a third institutional difference, we talked about the filibuster and its absence, weaker veto override rules. 27 states allow for the popular initiative and/or referendum in some fashion. Now, these devices have particularly mixed consequences for policy gridlock and speed and frequency of enacting policies. On the one hand, they allow for the overcoming of policy gridlock and increase the speed and ease of passage of legislation. One need only look at how California Governor Jerry Brown ultimately secured passage of tax increases that had for several years been blocked by the legislature. This is how marijuana legalization measures were passed in Colorado and Washington when neither of the state legislatures and governing officials of those states were willing to put forward such a policy. And just to take one of many other examples that could be cited, this is how supporters of parental notification requirements in Montana secured passage of an abortion restriction this last year. A legislature controlled by Republicans was willing to pass parental notification, vetoed by a Democratic governor. So what they do, they went through the initiative process and got it passed. In all these senses, then, one could view direct democracy as overcoming policy gridlock. On the other hand, and I stress that as mixed effects, and we'll talk more about this, direct democracy has, in some instances, been the vehicle for enacting the very supermajority requirements that created policy gridlock. Of course, that was how we got the 2/3 tax increase rule in California that they had to then resort to direct democracy to overcome. Additionally, it's to be noted that in some instances, direct democracy can be used to block or overturn policies that were enacted through the legislative process. And in that sense, could be seen as contributing to the difficulty of enacting policies. One thinks of a change in collective bargaining rules enacted by a unified Republican government in Ohio in 2011 that was overturned through the referendum process. Or another referendum later that year overturning an elimination of same-day registration in Maine, passed by a unified Republican government and overturned through the referendum process. The bottom line, then, is that direct democracy, of course completely absent at the federal level, has mixed effects on policy gridlock. From one perspective, it can be seen as allowing for the overcoming of gridlock by permitting passage of policies blocked by one or both branches. But from another perspective, it can also be seen as inhibiting passage of policy by allowing for enactment of supermajority rules and by allowing for the overturning of legislative enacted policies. Well, my overall point, to start to sum up, is that to the extent that our concerns about governability are focused on the prevalence of policy gridlock and the difficulty of passing policies, acknowledging very much that we could have other criteria for governability aside from ending policy gridlock and encouraging speed and passage of policy. But to the extent that our concerns about governability focus on policy gridlock, the more majoritarian features of state governing institutions will generally go much farther than the supermajoritarian features of the federal institutions in overcoming this concern. Of course, to advance such a conclusion only serves to prompt further question whether there are disadvantages of the more majoritarian features of state institutions, in the sense of failing to provide adequate deliberation or failing to build sufficient consensus in favor of the policies that are enacted. And further questions are raised about whether these disadvantages might even outweigh their advantages in the sense of contributing to the speed and ease of policy. To put this bluntly, how should we view the fact that a lame duck Michigan legislature was able to enact right-to-work legislation last month so quickly and without effective resistance, when a different set of institutional arrangements that was sort of in place at the federal level, such as the filibuster, had they been in place, that would not have passed in Michigan. Now, the illustration that we pick here obviously is crucial. We could swap out the Michigan right-to-work legislation. I'll put in the passage of tax increases to cut into a deficit in Illinois in 2011 by January 2011 by a similar lame duck Illinois legislature. At least, though, raising this question and acknowledging that people's evaluation might well depend on what we insert in for that illustration there. Raising this question, considering these illustrative cases, forces us to consider how we should ultimately assess the more majoritarian features of state governing institutions in contrast with the supermajoritarian features of federal institutions, and how to weigh the relative vices and virtues. My takeaway point, to finally close. Scholars are so focused on the federal level, we generally don't look at the way that things operate differently at the state level. And this is particularly true of governing institutions in particular. We're so accustomed to a certain set of institutions at the federal level. We often don't consider that a very different set of institutions frequently operates at the state level. A look at these different institutions at the state level and their consequences. I focused here on the filibuster, veto override requirements, and direct democracy, but we could consider others, the ease of state constitutional amendment at the federal level, at the state level, as opposed to the federal level. But a look at these various distinctive state institutions and their consequences is interesting in its own right, but also offers a way for scholars to gain some perspective on the possible consequences of adopting reforms of federal level institutional arrangements. Thank you.
Well, in order of seniority, I guess, with some references to age, those of us who are older take offense to here. But anyway, well, I'm going to give some general remarks, probably not focus on specific things like the top two and the redistricting commissions, and save that for question and answer. To Lynn's questions, she asked, first of all, is state government better than the federal government? I would say no. State government isn't necessarily better, but in many cases it's different. And it's all about the trade-offs, and sometimes the trade-offs fit certain situations better than others. And secondly, to her question, what can we learn from hybrid states? I think hybrid states give us a glimpse of the world that Sandy would like to take a step into, which is easier constitutional revision. And again, I think you have to be careful about stepping into that world, and there may be some intermediary ways to get into that world, but you'll see that there are some problems if you make the path too easy. And in this sense, I think listening to people in this conference, my effort here is not to say that the institutional design enterprise should stop or it isn't good, but to only temper some of the expectations that people have about this enterprise. And in that, it's in the spirit of things that have been said by Jane Mansbridge or Bill Galston or Heather Gerken, And in their moments of clarity, John and Norm.
Fleeting moments.
I like to keep them on their toes. You know, these guys, they get complacent otherwise. It's all right, they do it to me. All right, so there are three basic things then. First is that hybrid states, and I think this was mentioned in the previous talk, really do, hybrid states, by the way, is the term of art in the West for states that combine the direct democracy component with representative democracy. And so hybrid, it's a hybrid form. And whether they work with one another or in tension with others is an interesting question, but we're not going to be able to get into this right now. But anyway, hybrid states give us an insight into the institutional implications of this, and it shows that you can get innovation, very important innovation, and that's what John was talking about. But you also get rule manipulation, weakened rights, and physical constraints, for what that's worth. Secondly, I'm going to say that there are multiple paths to political dysfunction, and I'm going to use the examples of New York and California. To my amazement, I've been reading the Brennan Center's reports on New York government, and I practically fainted when, at parts in the report, they praised the California legislature. And I just would love to take this and show it to reporters in California. And then thirdly, as I said, I want to, and here I'm going to pick a fight with Norm and Tom, because I'm going to pick a fight on the subject of whether you can tinker with institutions to fix political partisanship. And I'm going to say that in California we've been doing this for 15 years and we haven't really made a lot of progress. So while I completely endorse the sentiment, I told Tom when he made his remarks, the reason I laughed is I thought he wanted to actually eliminate the GOP. And I thought my friend Tom had become really, what was the term, crypto-fascist, whatever. I thought, oh my God, he's really gone over deep end. But it turned out he really wanted to do what we've been trying to do for 15 to 20 years, which is incentivize the Republican Party to get out of its deep hole and become a responsible partner in government. And you know how successful we've been with that. So now, so let me get to the first point, which is, Sandy's world. Sandy has written about the federal constitution, and he makes a very compelling case that because even though we have four paths to changing the constitution, they're extremely difficult paths. They require supermajority votes in the Congress and elsewhere. And as a consequence, there are many features of the federal constitution which are anachronistic and problematic. And that's pretty much hard to argue with it. I think Sandy does a great job of pointing out some of the ludicrous ones. So now we have the opposite case. So we'll take California, which is the opposite case. Their constitutional amendment can pass with a simple majority of the voters who show up, which can be a very small fraction of the total electorate and an even tinier fraction of the population. And so Prop 13 passed with less than 20% of the eligible electorate supporting it. Secondly, the signature requirements are very easy to overcome, particularly in the era of professionalization. That is, what happened was, in the early days of direct democracy, it's more of a volunteer effort, but of course, just like every other aspect of campaigning, it's become professionalized. And starting in the 80s, we had firms that specialized in getting these measures on the ballot. They hired paid signature gatherers, they developed the techniques. They can pretty much guarantee getting anything on the ballot if you have enough money. If you have $1 million, $1.5 million, $2 million, you can get something on the ballot. You could get Sandy Levinson for president on the ballot. I'm absolutely sure. Thirdly, the revision versus amendment distinction in the law is very weak. In theory, you can't change the Constitution in its absolutely, either numerically or qualitatively in a way that affects the balance of power. In reality, the court doesn't get into the state court, didn't really buy the revision versus amendment argument, and this came out in the term limits where some of us wrote to the court and said, look, I can't think of a more profound way to change the balance of power between the legislature and the executive branch than to have draconian term limits with lifetime bans. And Nelson and I both wrote briefs to this, and there was not even a mention of those arguments in the court's decision on that. So the revision doctrine versus amendment doctrine is gone, and the single subject rule occasionally gets implemented, but it pretty much does not restrict people from linking popular things with unpopular things in order to get the public to vote for something, and then you're stuck with everything that they've given you. So that is the world that if you're not careful you can be into. Now, you could, in theory, fix some of those things, but we don't. Because, frankly, the public likes the system as it is, and I've gone through the different stages. It's kind of like accepting death, you know. You go through the first stage of, oh my God, we can't really have the system. And then it's resignation, oh well, I guess we're going to have this system. To thirdly, okay, if we're going to have this system, what's the best way to have this system? And that's where I hope I am. That's the way I get up in the morning anyway. So, what has it given us? Well, it's given us innovation. Not necessarily the innovation that all of us would want or dream about, for example, term limits. But it's given us the top two. It's given us Prop 13. It gave us the redistricting commission first for the state legislature and then for the Congress. In many of these instances, I, as a voter, was opposed to the idea, but as a political scientist, I was cheering for the idea because there's nothing better than a patient that wants to rip open his body so you can see what's inside it. And to me, this was the equivalent of the World War for medicine. It really allowed to see how the wounds were working. And since most of you guys don't care about California, it's no problem for you. But so I felt morally torn. But my career has certainly been built partly on all the disasters that California's undertaken. It's amazing that Stanford and California invited me back. But anyway. So you have innovation, but you also have rule manipulation, and I think John was talking about that. That is the attempting to get rules which are an extension of policy. So we lose that classical distinction between the rules of the game, which are set in a veil of ignorance without knowing what the stakes are, versus setting the rules of the game when you know what the stakes, the policy stakes and the political stakes are. And that, gone. We completely know what the stakes are when it's thrown out there. And so you get rule manipulation, and you get weakened rights. I mean, the Prop 8 story in Saga was there was an original measure. It looked like Schwarzenegger and the legislature were heading towards gay marriage. So then they put a measure on the ballot. And think of, by the way, direct democracy as an at-large election, with all the features of an at-large election. And so you get basically a different outcome than you would in the legislature, even if you took away the money. Because when you divide up an electorate into districts, and some of them have lower ratios of voters to population, you're going to get a different outcome than if you run a statewide election. So, you know, you get weakened rights in the sense that it was a proposition, two propositions that basically were at stake here. First one was overturned by the state Supreme Court, and then now Prop 8. So, now again, you may not care about weakened rights. You may think that the federal floor for rights is all you need, and you do this doctrine that somehow states could enhance rights was really unnecessary, but that's what's essentially happened. And then you get mandated expenditures to earmark taxes. That is to say, people sometimes, for noble reasons, sometimes not, say that you have to spend the money in a certain way, or that there are limits in how much money you can spend, et cetera. So you get a higher level of fiscal constraint. So let me move to my next point, because I do understand that we really want to do Q&A, and that is that there are multiple paths to fiscal and political dysfunction and actually success. And I take the cases of California and New York. Now, the Brennan Center, and I must say I really am becoming more and more of a fan of the Brennan Center, because they've done a really good job of going out and collecting the state laws and regulations. And so on any topic, from voter ID to fiscal or to legislative procedure, they're these wonderful reports that really summarize what's going on in terms of the laws. And they've done 3 reports on New York, and I'm living in New York as part of this fellowship this year. And, you know, I had some experience with the New York system when I was involved in a case the Brennan Center had a few years ago, which was challenging the way that judges were nominated through this convention system was totally dominated by bosses. And I was in charge of a team that went through the minutes and documented how infrequently there was any discussion and how it was pretty clear that this was all being rigged. This violated my notion that the court should be doing anything to fix the political system. But again, I don't always hold to principles when I think I can learn something. So I got involved in the case. So I kind of knew that the New York system was, shall we say, different, not only from California, but from the federal system. And you know, some of their findings, they've written 3 reports, continually asking, why don't things get better? We've written a report before about this. I have an answer for them, but I want to stay friends with them at least for the rest of this year. Anyway, so in both chambers, they say, leadership maintains a stranglehold over the flow of legislation at all stages of the process. The committee meetings are infrequent in both chambers. Most standing committees in both chambers fail to hold any hearings on major legislation, any hearings whatsoever. There were no detailed committee reports attached to any major bills in the Senate. The Assembly doesn't require substantive reports. The legislatures introduced an extraordinary number of bills, 3 times the number in California. California, by the way, adopted a limit on the number of bills. 100% of the bills that were allowed to reach the floor of either chamber passed with almost no debate. And that the bills that received a floor vote lacked critical and required information. The conference committees failed to reconcile similar bills. Member resources were distributed inequitably, blah, 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 blah. The process was opaque. So it is a rather pathetic state to be in, to be compared unfavorably to the California legislature. That is truly, if you were going to insult somebody, this is really, at least in California, the highest form of insult, but apparently New York has achieved that. But notice that the critique is all proceduralist. Okay, it's all proceduralist. It's the notion of liberal proceduralism that there should be transparency, there should be participation, there should be debate, etc. So it's a critique on the process. And here, this is where Jane Mansbridge and occasionally Bill and others have talked about, well, wait a minute, you know, are we so sure that maximizing the values of participation and transparency actually produces better legislative outcomes? Why don't we modify our proceduralist thinking by looking at the outcomes? You know, because in effect, a legislature is a proxy for a kind of utilitarian calculation. It's trying to do the best for the greatest number. It's a kind of noisy, somewhat hard to watch sometimes process, but that's what it's trying to achieve. And so it's not, some of the justification for democracy is self-expression of values, about individuality and equality, etc. But let's face it, if it wasn't working for us, we wouldn't accept that form of government. And so the argument ultimately for democracy has a component that somehow it maximizes the welfare to a greater degree than other forms of government, and that the agency costs are somehow lower, if you like. So the interesting thing is that both of these systems, highly flawed in completely different ways, have done some landmark things. By the way, California passed AB 32, which was you know, a cap and trade program within the state. New York was very quick out of the box to take a look at the assault gun ban. Okay. Now I did a study. It was not very, shall we say, systematic. It didn't have time to do the econometrics or anything, but we did a study where we compared some 3 states that were sort of hybrid states with traditional states like New York, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey, and just said, hey, let's take a look at the revenue patterns and the expenditure patterns in these states, and let's see, does the form of government produce any great variance that you can see on the top of it? Now, admittedly, you have to do a much more sophisticated study than I had time to do, but you know, we found some divergence on the revenue side. That is, New York was always on the high end of revenue relative to other states throughout this period that we looked at. Whereas California went up and down. You had Prop 13, total state and local funding went down, but then it recovered because in equilibrium, the median preference for spending was far higher than what Prop 13 had given us. And so what happened was you had a growth back in fiscal expenditures through fees and charges and bonds increased, etc. So in the end, the path, the fiscal path, we liken it to like a balloon. You can squeeze it in some way, but it's going to come out in other ways. And that's basically what was happening in terms of these fiscal constraints. constraints is that it did, at least with respect to revenue, do that. And there was more reliance on fees and charges in California, and of course, an especially big decline in property taxes. So any tax that's very visible that shows up once a year, you know, voters hate that. Homeowners hate that. It sucks. Whereas if you put it into, you know, sales tax or whatever, or you hit the wealthy people, which we've increasingly done in California, that's much more popular. So you do see that it affects the distribution of taxes to some degree, but also but what was really striking was the similarity in spending patterns between New York and California. That is to say, we saw the same trends in health and social services and public safety. All that spending was up, and a slight decline in higher education and an increase, and in California a little bit more of an increase in environmental spending and more of a decrease in higher education spending. Whether that's actually because the voters wanted it, because a lot of polls show that voters actually like higher education, or whether it was getting squeezed because voters wanted something else, i.e. more police protection, more money, more prisons, etc., and then we're unintentionally squeezing higher education is, I think, a subject of some that requires a little more thought or a study. So lastly, let me just say, I think we should be cautious about tricking the GOP into being a better partner through institutions. I think it's worth the try. We've been trying for 15 years. So at one time I was right with you on this. And the blanket primary, the top two, almost every redistricting reform is motivated in California by the business community, centrist Democrats and centrist Republicans, wanting to get the Republican Party out of this deep hole that it has put itself ever since Pete Wilson. And the decision, what happened with the party, two things. One, in 1978, you had the tax revolt, so you had a whole bunch of people that revolted against the growth of government under Pat Brown and the period of expansion in California government. So number one, in 1978, you had the tax revolt. That changed the Republican Party considerably. It was still pretty good, and it was working pretty closely with Democrats. But then you had, in the 90s, Pete Wilson deciding that he needed to get reelected, and he came to the IGS, and his campaign manager said, and we're going to get back into a second term using immigration reform. And at the time, I was studying all the polls. I said, that's ridiculous, it'll never work. And of course, it did work. But it had long-term consequences to the party. Here was a state that was becoming demographically more non-white, and so they were at the head of the curve of where the Republican Party is right now. They basically staked on their claim on Reagan Democrats and some conversion of Democrats in Central Valley, and of course that bet was wrong, so the party's now in a deep, deep hole. And as they're in a deep hole, as they've lost control of the legislature, they have occasional moments like people like Arnold Schwarzenegger take over the governor's office. Arnold was not one of them. They did not like Arnold at all, but they basically put up with him because they knew that was the best thing they could get. But in terms of the legislature, they're now in such a deep hole that they've lost supermajority control of the legislature. How ironic that California gets rid of the supermajority rules with respect to passing the budget just at a time that the Republicans lose that ability to use it. By the way, when you look at the record, they didn't really use that power very much because we had divided government for a long period of time in the post-war period. Anyway, so let me just talk about top two briefly, but I think we can get into it more. So here's what we know about the top two. The top two, let's take Congress, which Tom and Norm know as well as anybody in the country. It basically had 8 races that pitted Democrats against one another. I think it was 5 Democrats and 3. Let me see if I get this right. I've got it written down here. I want to make sure I have it right. I think at any rate, there were 8 congressional races. More of them were, it was either 5 or 6 of them were Democratic races. And what you can say about the argument for the top 2 was that because you'd have these overwhelmingly Democratic Republican seats, and in these overwhelming Republican Democratic seats, the more conservative, more liberal would get through the primary, and then they would face a weak opponent from the other party. So the idea was let's have a second round where you're running against another Democrat and another Republican, and that other Democrat or that other Republican would be more to the center. Well, first of all, hasn't been the pattern so far, okay? And let's take the highly visible Berman-Sherman race. Whatever we can say, it wasn't much of an ideological choice. And even the Pete Stark race it's only that Pete has become so bizarre and eccentric that, it's hard to characterize what his politics was at the end. I'll leave it to Tom. I don't know how you characterize it, but it was kind of insane. So what you would say is that it did clean up a couple people like Pete Stark and Laura Richardson, who either were not competent. So it acted kind of like a recall, and it gave Democratic voters a chance. But it doesn't seem to, as yet, to have produced huge ideological differences. If you take all the races, approximately 18% of them featured races between Dem, Reap. But it's that combined with the redistricting, we're going to be watching. And I've learned that the best thing to do is just wait. We'll get the data, we'll take a look, we'll see if it makes a difference. Now, I tend to be a little skeptical. I don't agree with everything that Larry says, and he'll find out more in a couple days. But I do agree with one thing, which is that I think the Lesters have an inertial effect on party positions. I think they mire people. And you can see this when I've had students that go out to think of running for office, and then we tell them where to go to try to get money, and you can't go to a trade union, you can't go to the Chamber of Commerce without making some promises about what positions you're going to take. So it does, I think, rigidify positions, and so I'm skeptical about the top two for a couple reasons. Number one, you always have to think with these reforms, what are the bastards going to do when they know what the rules are? Okay, it's a repeated game. So they're going to say, okay, you know what? Our nightmare is having 5 Dems run, knock themselves out, so that you get 2 Reaps in the final in a closely contested race, which happened, of course, in one of the congressional races in Los Angeles and Riverside. So what are they going to do? Well, the invisible primary suddenly becomes more important than the primary, right? Because you're going to get in there, and you're going to make sure all your money endorsements go to the person that you want. So that's problem number one. And then problem number two is even once they get elected, they're going to have to get the money, and the money's going to have to come from either the party or the interest groups. And so, you're going to have to make concessions there. So I'm skeptical going in, but as John points out, I'm always skeptical about every reform. He claims that I'm somewhere mired in the second best world and unable to get to a higher level.
And usually right.
And usually right about it, yes. Well, at any rate, it's not quite right, but anyway, I won't argue now about this. But at any rate, so we'll wait and see what happens with the top two. Again, it's a wonderful experiment. We didn't have enough time with the blanket primary, partly because we all went into court and fought about it, and the court threw it out. But I think the top two is going to survive that, so now we'll have a chance to see what difference it makes. Okay, thank you.
We're scheduled to end at 12:15, so I think we'd like to move right into the Q&A. Sandra, you're going to be the purveyor of the microphone. In the back, we can. Yeah.
Hi, I'd like you to talk a little bit about fiscal capacity in the states. With the federal government's fiscal woes, there's going to be less money going to the states from the federal government. We've seen the states obliged to maintain balanced budgets. We've seen the states under a great deal of fiscal stress, and with pensions and other problems facing the states. What's their capacity to actually be innovative policymakers of any sort, rather than merely trying to keep the ship afloat?
Right. Okay, so 2 things. One is that many of the states are technically not allowed to run budget deficits. And this, of course, raises really interesting points about Keynesian economic policy, right? Because the federal government under Obama was trying to do stimulus spending at a time when the states were facing huge deficits, and so they were going in the opposite direction. they were substituting federal funds for money that they were cutting. And I raised this at Brookings, when the economists were talking about all this, and I said, well, in your models, how well do you model what's going on with the state spending in reaction? Because you have to understand that many of them are under severe constraints, even if they wanted to spend that money. And of course, many of the states didn't want to because they were Republican controlled. So problem number one is that you do have, you can't technically run a deficit. Now, or in reality, thank God for democracy, it cheats all the time. And so states do have all kinds of bookkeeping ways of pretending to balance the books, but in fact defer payments for a year. So they do something like that, but it's still a highly constrained form of deficit spending. And it's interesting, of course, the press and anybody that's also kind of from a strict liberal proceduralist point of view gets offended by all that. They don't believe in the value of slack in the system, but of course slack is absolutely needed in the system because having run something at the University of California that was for a while dependent on state money, it's very hard to plan a budget if you don't know how much money you're going to have next year, okay? You don't know who to hire, you don't know what programs to do, et cetera. And I was hiring faculty for teaching at UCDC. So, you know, my answer, by the way, was to privatize the place and basically take a hedge on California. I bet that California would go down and that fees would go up, and boy did I win that bet. So we were flush with money, thank you very much. But anyway, so problem number one then are these various constraints. But problem number two is when you fix taxes and expenditures by the public, they're not thinking about this in some kind of virtuous way. They're thinking about what they have to pay. So if you can sock it to the wealthiest people, then you're going to do that. If you're going to depend on stock options, you're going to do that. If you're going to, you know, get rid of the motor vehicle license fee because Arnold said he'd do that, you're going to do that. If you're going to cut property taxes, you're going to do that because those are things that the middle class favor. But here's what it leaves you. It leaves you in a situation of pro-cyclical taxes and high volatility. Because when you're relying on the upper income groups, particularly on the stock options, you just got to hope that Facebook gets it right. You got to hope that Google does not go down, okay? Because your revenues are going to rise and fall with the stock market, and I think all of us have been through that one, right? So there's an extreme volatility of that, and it's pro-cyclical as a matter of fact. Whereas the nice thing about property taxes is they're kind of pro-cyclical, but they're on a lag. So we don't have any stability, and of course, much as the University of California, which I used to be at up until last summer, appreciates the fact that Prop 30 passed and that you got an increase in income taxes and sales taxes. I mean, the bottom line is it took a situation which was already bad and made it worse because the taxes became more pro-cyclical, which means, yes, the economy is recovering. Yes, Jerry's got the deficit down to $1.5 billion, but we're just setting ourselves up for the next time the economy turns down again. So, you know, I think I honestly think there's value to allowing the voters to check the legislature in many things, but I think it was a huge mistake to give them so much power, and some states don't do this, by the way, so much power over revenues and spending, and I've only scratched the problems that arise when you do this by piecemeal initiative measures that don't necessarily have a connection to one another. It leaves you with a huge mess.
Thanks for both the presentations. I appreciate John's qualifications on this, but we do see lots and lots of states with unified government now. I don't think that's just an anomaly. You see a lot of the southern states which are realigned at the federal level before now. The last 5 or 6 years, 5 or 6 states have gone having Republican majorities. Are we essentially going to see red state legislation, blue state, 20 states which are looking very different? We see an election law or ID, same-day registration. You see a number of Republican states now proposing abolishing their income tax, where Democratic states are raising revenues. I mean, are we really going to see a significant divide in state policy that's more permanent? Because these states are likely to have these majorities without much of a block.
I would say somewhat more permanent. There could be some ebb and flow in there. That is, with Arkansas State House and Senate going Republican in 2012 election, that leaves none of the chambers of southern state legislatures Democratic. That's a remarkable transformation, obviously, in a 2-decade period. And it leaves us with only one Democratic governor in those 11 Confederate states, and that would be Arkansas. And so other states such as that are now in the unified category, such as Wisconsin, such as Michigan, those are clearly more susceptible to movement. What I've tried to do, though, here today is to take that as a given and say, yes, given that we have these unified, a greater number of unified party-controlled governments, institutions still make a difference in that regard, and perhaps that can even be instructive as we think about reforms to federal institutions. That can be, we always talk about laboratories of experimentation of study. That's an experimentation itself, is what happens when you combine these unified party-controlled governments with majoritarian features. And as I say, the example I gave from Michigan is a classic one. If Michigan is one thing to have unified party government, it's nothing to have unified party government and not combine that with the filibuster. You get that situation in place, you get right to work law passed speedily and without resistance. You can take, otherwise you can take unified party government and combine that with the filibuster or some other supermajoritarian requirement, and you don't get what you got in last month in terms of right to work.
Sandy and then John, I saw his hand.
John has written a marvelous book called The American State Constitutional Tradition. But one of the questions that it asks, and I pose to my students, is you do discover that American state constitutions are very different from the U.S. Constitution in all sorts of ways. And so a question I'll toss out, okay, is the Constitution of Texas or New York, or Illinois, it doesn't matter, better or worse than the U.S. Constitution? And how do you answer that question? Is there a metric? Or do you end up saying some version, well, each of these constitutions is perfect for the state for which it is written, for God knows what reasons. But in any event, that's kind of foolish even to engage in a kind of macro comparative enterprise. And this has implications, of course, for comparative constitutionalism cross-nationally, but that constitutions are such intimate things that they really can't be compared very usefully. But if you are going to compare them, you've thought about this much more than I have. Do you tell your students Nebraska is really a model for all states with no larger population than New Zealand? In getting rid of the Senate, Jesse Ventura was absolutely right. And maybe direct democracy in some form is a good thing, generally speaking. Or do you say, well, no, you really have to learn, it's just there are so many different ways of running the constitutional system. Who can tell which is better?
I think one of the things it can do to take a look at the distinctive features of state constitutions and state institutions is it can take us far enough that we can start to make reasonable judgments about consequences of different institutional arrangements. To say consequences of leaves open the question of how you're going to evaluate those consequences. It can lead us, for instance, we can look at Nebraska's unicameral and compare what that do to camerals, and as we take various metrics that people do apply, people say, well, actually the consequences aren't all that dramatic. You don't get a big difference from Nebraska's unicameral from other bicameral legislatures. Now, within those metrics, there are some differences, and it depends on which of those metrics you want to apply. It might lead you to prefer unicameral to bicameral. So one can take state constitutions as compared with the federal constitution in general and say, what do you have to take when you have policy-laden, detailed constitutions versus policy absent general provisions of state constitutions, and then one can say, well, various consequences flow from that. The most difficult work, though, of course, it always is then to evaluate and say, how does one prefer one set of consequences to another? And that one has to bring in something from outside or a certain set of criteria, and that's going to differ widely.
And this really falls on this question, but it's addressed more to Bruce, which is, you had that nice discussion of New York and California, and you discovered that there's a sense you know, that they achieve very similar policy paths in some ways. And they're quite different functioning institutions in the sense that the New York State Legislature, as far as I know, only has 2 people in it. You know, whereas California has many, many people. You know, County Initiative, millions of them. You know, so they're very different institutional implementations of their constitutions. You know, and yet functionally they seem to realize similar results. So the question I have is, given that states are embedded institutions, that's to say that their borders are open, that there's a federal government around there, you know, sort of to absorb their debt when necessary. There's all kinds of cushioning that happens with states, even if sometimes it's not cushioning very well, but partially, even in this last collapse, it was cushioning, what happened in the states. Could we say that the institutional choices, the formal institutional choices that are made in state constitutions are likely to be not all that consequential? In other words, that maybe it's not the place to look for what different institutions make, and not a place where you're going to find lessons for what's possible for the federal government, because the federal government is not embedded in a larger structure, you know, so, yeah, there's nothing cushioning it, and they can run, you know, huge debt and carry it. So I'm just curious about how to think about institutions,
Right.
Given your comparison.
Yeah, well, I think the cushioning point is a really important point. It not only fiscal cushioning, but also rights cushioning. It makes it possible for direct democracy not to be as problematic as it might otherwise be. I guess I wouldn't, I think I'd come down on, I would temper expectations about what you could achieve through that, but I wouldn't say that it's completely non-consequential. I think that you can point to changes like term limits that made a huge difference in the way the legislature operates. It definitely changed which interest groups would have more power. Basically, the lobby groups that give money became much more powerful than the interest groups like the University of California or the counties and cities. There's an enormous amount of intergovernmental lobbying going on at the state level. And that intergovernmental lobbying, for the most part, is without money. And then the police and the fire and the teachers and others are giving money. And UC's thought about it, but they stayed out of the money game. And guess who won and guess who loses? Okay, so, I mean, I think it has, but even more fundamentally, the legislature is even less careful about its deliberations than it used to be. And so you get many more bills that are kind of trivial, and you get fewer investment in long-term bills that have infrastructure in mind or payoffs down the road. So you can change the time horizons as well. So, but at the same time, I think what I'm saying is that because of these constraints, it's not only cushioning, but it's also that a lot of state spending is federally mandated or driven by federal incentives. And so that could be why you see that. Also, I think you've got 2 fairly liberal states, and so, again, I keep coming back to, I think that the median preference does find its way through the cracks and crevices of whatever system you have, and does show up. It may take a different path, and New York has been a consistent, stable path of liberalism, but in California it's been more up and down, partly because of Prop 13, but also partly because there's been demographic growth underneath that, and it's kind of hard to separate those things out. So I think, so I come down not quite as nihilistic about what you can learn from that. And I do think direct democracy, you can learn from direct democracy. There are people that are proposing, that not only propose term limits, of course, for the Congress, but there were people that were proposing a national referendum or initiative. And I think you can learn about that. I think that we've learned that there are some forms of direct democracy that fit much more naturally with representative government. The recall, the indirect initiative, I think the referendum, even to some extent, I think is compatible with representative government. I think what happens with direct democracy is you're setting up an alternative, a parallel channel with popular initiative, where you get policy entrepreneurs that can formulate their proposals in secret without any of the kind of demands that we put on the legislature in terms of hearings and transparency, and things get stuck in there that we don't really understand. Well, of course that happens in the legislature too, so I'm saying that it doesn't happen. But I do think that, that we've learned a lot about how direct democracy either can work with or be in conflict with representative government. And I think that lesson has made difference to the way people think about a national initiative, made people much more, they look at California and I think they're much more reluctant to go that direction than they would have been, say, 40 years ago.
I was wondering, what did you think the feasibility of using the reserve funds and that an annual set aside in the annual budget as a way to balance across the risk of income tax? It seems like the fiscal issues of state governance is a pretty big issue these days.
So you're talking about setting aside a reserve, is that what you're talking about?
Is that politically feasible?
No. Because Republicans want to give it back to the voters as a tax cut, and Democrats say, aha, this is a way to trick the system into spending more than they otherwise would. So in California, what happened is the Democrats took surpluses. Gray Davis is a good example of that. He had a surplus in the late 90s due to the stock market boom. And he did some wonderful things. He increased health insurance for children. He put more money into schools to reduce class sizes. But he put that in on the basis of expectations of revenue that came from a peak period when revenues were flowing in, and it was a pro-cyclical period, without any account for what the sort of average trend would be over that time. And so, and did the Democrats do that knowing that that was true? Yeah, but it's kind of like a game of dare. Here we've got this program. It's harder to close a program than to start one. So, you know, and how do they justify it? Well, they justify it because, damn it, those Republicans are unreasonable and they won't vote for anything, even, you know, taking care of children and paying for schools. So we got to do this. It's the same kind of, you know, basic little, if you like, game theoretic problem that we have right now at the federal level as well. That's changing congressional rules. It's sort of spy versus spy. Somebody does X and then you counter it this way. So reserves have not worked. We have set aside some money. By the way, even if we'd set aside the reserve we were talking about in California, the hole that was blown into our fiscal budget was so great because of all the pro-cyclical problems I was telling about that you couldn't possibly reserve the $16 billion that you needed you have to foresee that the hole would be that big. Then you'd have to convince voters that you're going to hold out $16 billion. And by the way, just recently in California, there was this, one of the, I think it was Parks and Recreation, had some reserve money that they may or may not know that they've had that was several $1 million, and everybody was up in arms because they kept reserve money. Well, guess what? When you're a bureaucrat, and I was a bureaucrat, reserve fund is a good thing because you've got cyclical funding, and when the bastards start taking money away from you, you can go to the reserve fund. So nobody's really thought about how you actually operate a government when you're not, when you have a volatile revenue stream and you don't have any slack in the system, and the voters won't give you any slack in the system.
We have Heather in the back and then Bill up front.
So this is a question that mirrors the intellectual trajectory of Bruce Cain. So it starts naively and then ends cynically. So I think the question is...
what do I do in the
What
middle?
was he
Do I ever hit a point of wisdom?
So it's actually a question for both of you, which is, you talked a lot about the ability of states to get stuff through because they have the votes and they don't have the procedural blocks, but this is a more naive question about their ability to make good policy. So what kind of capacity do they have? We know Congress has a lot of capacity, a lot of staff, a lot of services available to it to think through policy questions. And still the legislative subsidy, we believe during the call, really matters. So I just wanted to ask about the legislative subsidy at the state level. So Larry talked a lot about the financial subsidies that lobbyists provide, but what is the role of lobbyists and interest groups at the state level in providing the information that they need? So the MIC legislation, the MIC reports, the MIC polling, the MIC talking points, all the things that we know these guys provide to Congress. What do you think is going on at the state level?
Bruce?
Yeah, sure.
And then Jeff.
Well, first of all, this was a movement of legislative professionalism that came up in the 70s and enhanced staff capacity at the state level. And the glorious period was, at least in California, in the 70s and 80s. But then what happened is the legislature, when we started having these cycles, it was kind of like Detroit in the car companies. What happened to R&D in the car companies? Well, it sort of disappeared. Why? Because when profits went down, you had to make cuts somewhere, and R&D doesn't have an immediate return, so you get rid of the R&D component. And that's essentially what happened. California got rid of its nonpartisan legislative research centers. The Assembly did it first, and then they gradually whittled away the Senate as well. Because in the end, when you started cutting their budget, they needed to have their personal staff and their political staff more than they needed to have research. And so that's what happened to legislative capacity. Now, it's not bleak, because what happened is outside groups became very interested in providing this, which was where it was before the progressive era. There were the Institute of Governmental Studies, where Nelson and I worked for many years, was originally the research bureau for the legislature, and then it got incorporated in the legislature, and now it's come back out in their universities and their nonprofits. So I'm not sure that California lacks for good ideas and serious people thinking about it.
Okay, Phil?
Well, I think this discussion of governance at the state level has been extraordinarily fruitful. And I want to pose a question along a different dimension of the contrast between the federal government and the state governments. I know when I was mucking around in politics, and certainly time I spent in the White House, it was certainly the case that there was more commonality among governors of different parties than there was representatives of different parties in Washington. And I have the sense that although the NGA is a more polarized place than it used to be, that relatively speaking, one could still make that statement. And that leads to the following question, which I'll illustrate with an example. There's a very interesting case study that was just reported in today's Washington Post. Mike Pence, who used to be the head of the Republican Study Committee and nobody's idea of a moderate Republican, reasonable Republican, but hardly a moderate Republican. You don't get to be the head of the Republican Study Committee, either a closet or an out-of-the-closet moderate, has become governor of Indiana. Okay? I checked. There are, out of the 50 senators in Indiana, there were 37 before the November election. There are still 37. Out of the 100 members of the House in Indiana, there were 60 Republicans before the election. There are 69 now. So, so Governor Pence has a supermajority of his party in both houses. Nonetheless, he stood up and delivered a State of the State speech and his budget recommendations that called for very significant increases, in education, full day pre-K, $350 billion additional for infrastructure, and on and on and on. And the Indianapolis Star-Telegram, whatever it is, said, of the speech, not bold, but not polarizing either. Now, I guess what I want to suggest, just as a very vague hypothesis, is that there may be something about state government that forces you to focus more on governance than is the case at the federal level. That you're not as free at the state level to engage in the permanent campaign or to use legislation to send messages as opposed to actually doing something and getting something done. So my question is there anything to that hypothesis? And if so, could the anti-federalists have been onto something after all?
Various points to take up from there, and one is at the level of polarization among various types of officials, whether it's different from federal congressional members or state governors. One interesting thing to watch is we all watch decisions being made in regard to health care in response to the Affordable Care Act, discussions about whether to form exchanges of certain kinds, whether to accept the Medicaid expansion in that sense, and to watch how governors of various parties behave, but then as compared with, say, insurance commissioners of the various states. And there we see a difference of insurance commissioners, much less degree of polarization than of governors. And that would go to the point, they're most centrally focused on perhaps governing, administering, and dealing with a particular policy problem. And so that would go to that point that the more one is focused on governing and governing on a small locale, that would have an effect on behavior.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, and I don't know that I have a really good explanation. Partly it's a median voter effect that in a large state you're going to get some pressures to be a little more centrist, and then also maybe the nature of the kinds of decisions you have to make. You're more constrained as you move down the chain. And so as you talk to governors and then the mayors, increasingly they have the feeling that they get blamed for things that they have no control over. And then to some extent, of course, that's happening at the presidential level because of globalization, et cetera. But as you move down the chain, the food chain, it becomes increasingly hard in a lot of areas to have any discretion because of the various, not only federal mandates, but state mandates, and then various other limitations that happen. And so the nature of the decisions you're making at the very bottom are streetlights, infrastructure, police, et cetera, about which there's probably less division, less about redistributive programs. Those are going to be mandated by the federal government. But I think we've got to be cautious because we have seen, of course, some governors become extremely polarizing. And I'm not sure that there's really any good political science that I could point to that, undergirds our feeling that somehow it's a little bit more pragmatic. It's worth exploring, but I don't know that anybody's really done a good job of that.
Before we thank our speakers, Sandy has one announcement.
We have ordered some extra lunches, so I am cautiously optimistic, but I emphasize caution as well as optimism, that we may be able to provide everybody in the room with lunch in the Sheffield room. You just follow people over there. And then we will come back here promptly at 1:30 for the final session called Thinking Outside the Box, where you will get some quite radical suggestions, perhaps, for what we might do. And it also has the virtue of being relatively open-ended in terms of length, so there will be an opportunity, I think, to ask some questions and make some points that you might not have had so far. I also want to take this occasion to thank our Dean, Ward Farnsworth, who has been remarkably cooperative and supportive as I've sent him emails saying, I think I'm going to go over budget. I know I'm going to go over budget. And these extra lunches are just the latest example. So I really am very, very grateful. And now.
So with that, let's please thank our panelists.